Madam Chair, we are recording this meeting and we're also live streaming on YouTube. So we are ready to start.
Okay, thank you and welcome everyone to the PCAC meeting Wednesday, November 16th. First, I'll just take roll. We have board member Takis. Is he here? There he is.
This is me. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. Hello. Supervisor Walter Alcorn is here, I think.
I'm here. I'm Eric.
Hello. Supervisor Sylvia Glass. Is she here? Okay, she's not with us. Councilmember Sarah Bagley.
Present.
Hello. And we have Councilmember John Steely.
Good afternoon.
Vice Mayor Pamela Sebesky.
She's not on. This is Ralph, her alternate.
Oh, excellent. Okay, nice to have you, Ralph. Vice Mayor Preston Banks. I don't think he's going to make it. Councilmember Signe Fredericks is here, I think.
I'm here.
Hello. And Vice Mayor Marty Martinez. I don't think he's with us tonight, but we have Councilmember Stanley Milan. Is he here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, nice to have you. All right, well, welcome everyone. And let me move over to the agenda here. Okay. There we go. All right, well, the first item on the agenda is the summary notes of October 26, 2022. Are there any changes that anyone has to those meeting minutes? Okay, hearing none, those pass. Can we go back to the, thank you. And the next item on the agenda is to approve the recommendation to adopt the transaction update. Okay. Now, are we approving that or are we looking at that right now?
Madam Chair, this is Keith Jasper.
Yes.
I do have a brief presentation which is not in your packet. It's not particularly long, but it just steps you through a few things just really quickly. Let you know we have some information available on hand if anyone wants to revisit anything we've shared with you before.
Okay.
So I just wanted to quickly cover three topics: feedback from MBTA committees first, and then updates and enhancements that have been made to the final draft plan and project list, which was emailed to you a week ago, and then the requested endorsement from you. This presentation does have some reference slides, which I'm not going to use unless needed, providing an overview of transaction and a summary of public comments, which have been discussed at previous PCAC meetings, which is why I'm not proposing to talk about them. I'd also like to just quickly say that there are a number of places in this presentation that refer to page number. When I'm referring to page number, I mean the page number that's actually printed in the document or positioned in the document in the bottom left-hand corner. I realized that there was a PDF version which just starts numbering at page 1, but it's the format that I'm using. So if you have the document to hand or on a screen, it's the page numbers in the bottom left-hand corner that I'm referring to as I go through this. The first 6 slides in this presentation, we'll just click through quickly, feedback from previous meetings of this committee, as well as our technical advisory committee and planning and programming committee. So Harun, if you could advance to the next slide. That's it, thank you. And we've discussed this with you before. Some summary of the comments from the meeting and our responses in the indented bullet beneath each of the major bullets. So the general theme of these comments or responses to the comments is that, and we're saying that a transaction is looking at performance across the system as opposed to individual projects, which typically gets addressed as part of project development. reference to, you may recall, discussion about one of the graphics that showed a 54% reduction in emissions, and there were some question marks about the assumptions related to that. We have addressed that in the current version on pages 18 and 19. And essentially, just as a recap, there's as a best case scenario, worst case scenario, and 54% represents the best case scenario. What we're showing now is something that's closer to the worst case scenario, and the reality is probably somewhere in between. And the reason we can't be more precise is it depends on things that what will happen over time beyond MBTA and indeed your control. And the final one on this page are related to looking at 75 billion on 429 projects versus the outcomes from 3 scenarios, and really here it's just a reminder that the region has notable forecast population and employment growth. Doing nothing at all is not a good alternative, and also reliance on the scenarios, one or more of the scenarios coming to fruition, is also not a good alternative. As 2 of the 3 that we looked at are beyond MBTA and the region's control, and the third requires a considerable amount of multi-tiered governmental action. So sorry if we teased you with some potentially good news that avoided spending 75 billion, which the region doesn't have. But the reality is if we do nothing, then things will get worse, which is not a big surprise. On the next slide, this is your last meeting. And we've tried to kind of address these as best we can. We can't always address every comment that we receive. But essentially, in terms of the first one, we use the weighted performance measures that were discussed by this committee and others a year ago and approved by MBTA in November and December of last year. And we don't really have any flexibility to look at any other metrics than the ones that have been approved by MBTA. There's discussion about trying to identify the effect of what's referred to as extraterritorial projects, which in a sense is the territory here is Northern Virginia. So extraterritorial obviously means projects beyond Northern Virginia. But for these and other projects, transaction again considers performance across the entire system rather than the impact of individual projects. With that number of projects in transaction, it would take many years to actually complete the analysis of 429 projects, and we never set out to do that at any detailed level anyway. The discussion on the final bullet here about land use, transportation and land use connections, and emerging land use, and concern about the obsolescence of projects that MBTA may or may fund in the future. We certainly share the concern about not wanting to recommend MBTA invest money in projects that might become obsolescent, and that is why we incorporated the scenario analysis into the work we do. In addition, when transaction is adopted, as we have done for the last 5 years, we will continue looking at emerging travel trends to hopefully detect as early as we can anything that might cause us to be concerned about investment obsolescence. And as you know, we update transaction every 5 years, in part because that means we can stay reasonably current with what we're doing. Obviously not totally current, because 5 years is 5 years. But given that the process takes 2 to 3 years to complete, it does mean that we can stay reasonably current, because these things tend not to change dramatically, except for things like pandemics. Next slide, please. The next 2 slides address what happened at the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee meetings in September and October. Some of these things are quite small and granular, and some are similar to comments that have come from this committee. So if it's okay with you, I think I would like to skip over most of these. On slide 7, Haroon, the third the third bullet here is another example of kind of like where we are with the granularity of transaction. Transaction is a regional plan, which is really looking at a high level across the system, rather than down in the weeds, as you know, you would get to as you begin to develop projects. And one of the comments along these lines was asking us to show the number of planned new charging stations and kilowatt hours per station and so on. If you know, transaction doesn't get into this level of detail, there are some things that MBTA can potentially control if projects that are in transaction are funded. But as with many things, the rate of market penetration of electric vehicles in Northern Virginia and elsewhere is going to be primarily dictated by things that consumers want and are prepared to do, things that the auto manufacturers are able to do, and some of the things that MBTA can control, such as the infrastructure related to electric vehicles. But it's really hard for us to get into that sort of detail in a high level long range plan. Next. Thank you. Now, the PPC, the Planning and Program Committee, only met once during the September-October timeframe. They kind of split the difference and met early in October. So in theory, there should only be one page for them in this slide deck, but we got a lot of comments from them, so they still get 2 pages, even though it was one meeting. There was discussion about achieving MBTA's legislative mandate. You know, for us, the legislative mandate is really to be compliant with the Code of Virginia, which transaction is. But you know, we don't have a legislative mandate to achieve, you know, certain outcomes per se. That the mandate is to develop and maintain the plan, and to follow certain particular pieces of code in how we do that, which we do. The second question here is about addressing criticism of focusing on roadway. We don't accept that transaction does focus on roadway. You know, there are 424 projects covering multiple modes, but there are no funding commitments associated with any of the projects. And if anything, the largest amount of money that's allocated to projects is to transit, not to highway projects. So that I think was criticism that was made, but it doesn't actually reflect the reality of transaction. Where does the region want to be in 5 years? I think this was particularly in the context of being EV supportive. I mean, all we can really say here is that MBTA's funding track record for EV projects is supportive of advancing decarbonisation of transit systems. You know, where we fall on in terms of electrification for private vehicles and for fleet vehicles that are not transit is something which is hard to do within our legislative framework. But nonetheless, there are projects in transaction that potentially would allow those things to be funded. And then the next one about looking at larger picture is kind of really what we try to do with transaction anyway. On slide 9, this is more a comment about how we should communicate, particularly with regard to how we communicate about BRT and bus rapid transit. And we think we've addressed this in section 7. Success, it's been stated, will look different in different jurisdictions, which we're inclined to agree with, and we've done some sub-regional analysis, which I think is what is being referred to as being addressed on page 19. There was a question about the definition of build and no build networks, which we've attempted to address on page 18. Another question which kind of relates to how we look at build versus no build networks, which we've attempted to address in section 4 more generally, and providing a list of major projects that are in the no build. Some of you may recall from the last meeting that although we call it the no build, there are actually projects in the no build network which are being built or are fully funded now, such as the Silver Line extension. Yay, Silver Line yesterday. But what we kind of felt here is that this is really detailed information to get into in the transaction plan. There is a project list of 424 projects separately, but to start listing all the projects that are in the no-build network would really take us down a path of inconsistent granularity. So we will address this in the forthcoming technical report, which is not something that we're asking you to review or approve. It's just a technical documentation of the work that we've done, and we will include that information in that document. So that's kind of the recap on the committee meetings. Obviously, along the way, we've some of your comments reflect public comments, but we have taken account of public comments to the extent that we can in terms of changing the content of the documents. Some of the comments were, we like these projects and we don't like those projects, which is perfectly fine, but unless specifically directed, there's no intention to take projects out of transaction because they all meet needs that have been identified, and none of them have any funding commitment from MBTA associated with them by virtue of being included in this plan. So taking them out doesn't actually change anything in terms of funding. We think it's better to list everything, and then we deal with project selection as part of our 6-year program process, which follows adoption of transaction starting next year. I have to take a pause there if there's any questions on any of that before I move into a summary of the updates that we've made to the plan versions that you sent a week ago.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Mr. Jasper?
I do.
Okay, I'm trying to see who's
That's Signe.
oh, Signe, yes, please.
Hi,
Councilmember.
Councilmember. Mr. Jasper, at one point, if you could go back a couple slides, because I have a very poor memory at this stage of life, but one more. Concern that Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's legislation is outdated and should be revisited. I did not, I may not have noticed when you addressed that one, but is that something that we need to be involved in, or is that something that, that seems like a state level decision?
Monica's on the call. I'll defer to her to respond to that, unless you'd like me to.
Well, council member, what I will say is the authority has not expressed interest in changing the legislation. So
Okay.
That's why we put that when the TAC member made that comment, we stated noted.
Okay. So you received the question, but you are not concerned about it. Okay.
Well, and like I said, the authority has not expressed any interest. What I did respond to the particular TAG member who made the comment that we fund all modes except air travel, but we do fund projects that help air travel. And I think, to be honest, it's like, oh, well, your priority is congestion reduction, but that's one of the issues we look at. We have 10 performance measures, safety, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have a plethora of performance measures. And because of those performance measures, we are able to fund various modes because the needs of the region are diverse. So and that's what I told the TAC member. And I said, the authority has not expressed interest in changing their legislation. So
I think that goes to the sustainability question, in that NVTA isn't charged with addressing sustainability, even though it's in our documentation. So I appreciate that. Mr. Jasper, I also have a question in that when I went through these documents, I kind of made note of some of the jargon that I thought was confusing for possibly the public. Is that something to address here, or should I just send those separately because it sounds to me like you've gone pretty far beyond, verbiage and into getting ready to approve.
Yeah, Councilmember Freeze, thank you very much for that question, and Haroon did forward me some suggestions you'd made earlier. I was going to address this later in this presentation, but I'm happy to kind of say now that we always want to ensure that we're communicating in a way that is appropriate to the intended audience, and you, as a part of that audience, provide important feedback in that regard. So to the extent that we can, and I will address this in a few minutes, to the extent that we can, within the time available, if there are things which are confusing or not clear, then please let us know. I mean, one of the things where we're not really looking for feedback at this stage, to be honest, is changing the analysis or changing the project list. That they've been through multiple rounds of screening with your own staff and through our analytical process, and it's not really at this stage something that is any longer part of the review process. That's kind of considered to be done.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it from what you suggested. Okay. I should pause if there's any more questions.
Madam Chair, it's
Yeah.
Supervisor Alcorn.
Please speak. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Keith, thank you. The good, excellent presentation. Also, the handout materials are excellent. I love the interactive map as well. This is all very helpful. I did ask about this before, and I can't remember what the answer was, but and I know Transaction is not a cost planning tool, but I did want to ask about Transaction project ID number 34 again, and that's the new alignment for the Metro Rail Blue Line or Silver Line between Roslyn and Northern Virginia. That project alone comes in at $20 billion, which is not yet the selected locally preferred alternative. That's in there because that's the most advanced estimate, or I guess alignment or project along those lines that's being discussed. Is that how that's in there, even though it's not yet really even gotten to the locally preferred alternative process? Is that right?
I mean, that's probably correct. Yes. I mean, the all of the cost estimates are estimate, big emphasis on estimates. The selection of the projects for inclusion, either are generated by jurisdictional comprehensive plan or transportation components of comprehensive plans or transit system plans. In some cases, a limited number of cases, MBTA staff in conjunction with the consultant team have identified transportation needs that have not been identified by the projects that come out of comp plans and transit system plans, but would still be useful in addressing needs. But in some cases, those, the reason they're not in comp plans perhaps is it's because they're not advanced sufficiently in any detailed project development work to have precise alignments or costs. But given there's no funding commitment to any project in Transaction, that's not particularly critical. I mean, it would be worse to leave a project like that out than to include it with some uncertainty associated. And the reason I say that primarily is, projects that we, like the Roslyn bottleneck issue, which we know WMATA is looking at, has been looking at that for a year or so. We're a member of the technical team that's working with WMATA on that. So we're very closely in the loop. We've talked to WMATA about including this project in the document, in some form. And we've basically come up with the best we can that kind of blends what that project team has been looking at, with no commitment on their part or our part. But inclusion of the project in transaction does mean that if at some point in the next 5 years before we update transaction again, some piece, not the whole thing, obviously, because $20 billion is not going to happen. And even if the $20 billion existed, it would need a tri-state agreement of sorts certainly between MBTA, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, as well as WMATA, to figure out how to pay for the bits that are not in Northern Virginia, because we wouldn't fund the project outside of Northern Virginia either. There still need to be cost sharing. So, I mean, for those reasons, it doesn't seem likely that anything's going to advance on that. But if there was a slice of that could advance using MBTA money, the inclusion of that project in this version of transaction makes that eligible for funding from MBTA. Otherwise, we'd have to say, good project, but come back in 5 years because it's not in transaction.
Yeah, that I understand. And thank you very much, Keith, for that explanation. And thank you also for pointing out that a huge chunk of that would actually not be in Northern Virginia. That a big part of that, I mean, basically digging under M Street would be probably the majority of that funding. Just one other question, and this is actually in the plan summary on page 6. So it says 76% of 2045 commute trips by Northern Virginia residents will have a work destination in Northern Virginia. Thank you for pulling that out. Does anybody know what the current percentage is? And I realize the pandemic kind of screwed with that, but does anyone know what the current percentage of commute trips by Northern Virginia residents is to Northern Virginia?
Yeah, Dahlia Levin from the consultant team is on the call. I'm going to give her like 10 seconds to unmute herself. And while she's doing that, I would say it's broadly similar to the number that we're looking at for 2045. But Dahlia, do you want to put some meat on the bones there?
I do not know the number off the top of my head. I apologize for that. It is, I believe, slightly lower than that 76%. And y'all give me a little bit of time. I can dig that number up while you continue to talk.
Okay, thanks. And by email later is fine too.
Yeah, we can follow through. We can follow up with that.
Thank you. That's an awesome number. So yeah, thank you. That's all.
Supervisor Alcorn, thank you for asking that, because I think, and maybe we don't pull this out strongly enough, but I think that is really important to understand in long range planning for 2045, because I mean, I fall into this trap sometimes, and I think commuting is all about going to DC.
Right.
And that number really proves that it isn't. And to be honest with you, we have great infrastructure and other services to get from Northern Virginia to DC. But what that 76% number is saying is there's a lot of travel in Northern Virginia that stays in Northern Virginia for a commuting purpose. And that's, in large part why we have some of the problems we have, because we don't really have rail and other infrastructure to kind of cope with that suburb to suburb type commuting, which is why so many people end up driving. And that's one of the factors, behind our thinking in calling out a regional BRT system in this document. But it kind of takes a regional metro rail type approach, without involving the rail infrastructure, and therefore much less expensive and much faster to do.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I do fully expect that during the next 5 years, when we do this again, that we'll continue to see more north-south transit projects emerging and probably evolving. So yeah, thank you very, very much, Keith.
Thank you.
So, this is Srinath Budri here. If I may just jump in, I think it is 73% right now. So Keith and Dahlia both are correct that it is pretty close to what is now, and it is about 73%.
That's great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Would you like me to go on to the next section of the presentation, Jane?
Mr. Jaspers,
Yes.
just to complete Mr. Alcorn's thinking, we we are serving, of course, 1 out of 4 people, they are still commuting, crossing the river, crossing state boundaries here. But there is also one of the reasons why we have such a concentration of, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we have such a concentration of intra Northern Virginia travel is because we have been growing in jobs and population very vigorously. So there is, the mass is there here, but that means also that Northern Virginia is attracting workforce and commuting trips from across the region as well. And that's it's the other flow that we have to serve as well with transaction. We are moving also people inside Northern Virginia who be coming out from outside of Northern Virginia, and that's for me a significant part of the, of what transaction here tries to attack as well. I'm not intending to start a conversation on this, but I'm taking that very seriously in consideration, because a good part of my thinking, at least, is that we have to, a transaction has to have a commitment to increase mobility and, increase the transportation capacity across the river under all scenario, no matter how intensive or not the crossings are for our residents into the districts.
Yeah, I don't think you're looking for a response, but I certainly concur with your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Well, if I may, let me move on to the next section, which is to kind of focus on focus on some of the updates. These are the main ones to the draft plan that are incorporated into the versions that were sent to you last week. And I would say from the get-go, these are in close alignment with what we told you we were planning to do a month ago at your previous meeting. So that there's not really any great change here, but we just wanted to be clear about what we've done. So on the next slide, kind of broken this out into a few kind of groups of things I want to talk about. The first one is kind of more general in nature. So certainly, the consultants do a fantastic job in beautification. They've really spent some good effort on the design side of the document, which was always intended to come later from the earlier version that we use for public comment, just because that's quite an intensive thing to do. So we don't want to do it too early in the process. So there's that. And along that line, on the back cover of the plan, we've included some social media links, which are clickable for anyone who's got the digital version of this document. And we are focusing on most people using it digitally rather than in hard copy. We've done our own review for clarity and added enhancements where appropriate and in line with previous comments, although I think we've still got a little bit more we could do. And on the bottom of page 3 of the document, there's a short section that's been added that is referred to as relevant factors in the development of transaction. And some of these bullets actually mostly were from a discussion at the last meeting. So these were, specifically saying, we use the approved 10 weighted performance measures to measure the performance of the projects in the plan at the system level, compliance with the Code of Virginia. All our analytical work is based on the cooperative forecasts that come from COG, but that this is not a land use planning document, which, as I said before, we recognize is the sole responsibility of the local jurisdictions. And again, I've mentioned this already this evening, the inclusion of projects in transaction is not a funding commitment. but it does form an initial eligibility filter for upcoming 6-year program update cycles. On the next slide, okay, we've reduced the number of projects to 424. It was previously 429. So if there's any confusion, because I used the number 429 earlier in this presentation, which was right at that time, but at this time, we've eliminated 3 duplicate projects that we didn't identify until after we'd gone to public comment. And we've transferred 2 projects from the project list, in other words, the build network, to the no build network, which is essentially the baseline, because they were either funded or under construction, which means they met the definition of being in the no build as opposed to the build network. That latter transfer of projects between the build and the no build networks, we initially anticipated we wouldn't need to do any reanalysis, but out of an abundance of caution, the consultant team did it anyway. It led to some minor changes. Analytical results have been updated, but nothing of any note in terms of any finding at all arising from that reanalysis. Similarly, reducing those projects from the project list took $1 billion of cost out. That was mostly because a couple of those projects were high cost projects along 495. So the planning cost estimate is $74.9 billion. However, I shall refer to that number as approximately 75 billion to recognize the uncertainty associated and any spurious accuracy in terms of using decimal points to describe the total cost of those projects. So we're still about 75 billion, which is where we were last time. It's just instead of being slightly more than 75, it's now slightly less than 75. But the only thing you need to remember is 75. The 54% emissions reduction issue, which was raised in a number of comments, both from the committees and public comment. We wanted to be not looking to misrepresent anything. There's nothing actually inaccurate about the 54% number, but it did require all the assumptions that you want to see happening to actually happen. So a best case scenario is what the 54% represented. We've taken that out of the graphic that was concerned, and we've modified the text on pages 18 and 19 to reflect that. Excuse me. We've also added a bullet on page 22 related to the analysis of the regional BRT system, where we report mode specific results. We did do an analysis of highway projects and transit projects separately to see how they each performed as a group. And I would note that the bus rapid transit and high capacity transit projects, which account for about 10 billion of the cost in transaction, the BRT part of that, the BRT HCT part of that, accounts for about half of the increase in transit trips and about half of the other benefits associated with the transit only project analysis. Next slide. One thing we wanted to do, as covered in the first bullet here, is we've merged or incorporated what was previously section 7 into section 6, because the uncertainty analysis that we deal with through scenario analysis, we didn't want that to have too high an emphasis in the document, when it's actually more appropriate to kind of look upon it as more of a sensitivity test to the main main results that are covered in section 6. So we adjusted that accordingly. We removed, there was a chart showing scenario analysis related to the build network. We found this was disruptive to the overall flow of the document, so we took it out, but we did include some of the findings associated with that build network, scenario analysis of the build network on pages 24 and 25. And so in other words, we focused on what we learned rather than obscuring the flow of the document with the more the mechanics of how we learned it. We added a new summary of the scenario analysis results in a tabular format. So you can actually look at the impacts of each scenario side by side, and that's on page 24. And we did discuss at various points through this process land use as a scenario, which we did not formally include in our scenario analysis. All the scenarios that we looked at assumed no change in land use. But 5 years ago, we did look at land use as a scenario. And we mentioned that as passing, not in the table on page 24, but in the text on page 25. And the reason we took that approach is we felt that basically what we learned 5 years ago is broadly the same today. So it didn't need to be reanalyzed, but we felt it was worth mentioning. Obviously, moving previous section 7 into section 6 meant that section 8 now becomes section 7. And in section 7 on page 27, we revised the key takeaways to strengthen them and focus them a bit more and begin the pivot from transaction to future funding programs, where for our 6-year program, we kind of move to the next stage following transaction. So regarding the project list on the next slide, I've mentioned the removal of the 3 duplicates. These are summarized here. And for each pair, we've identified which project we retained. So in the first case, it was project ID 64. We removed ID 230, what was previously 230. For the second pair, we had 2 projects that were very similar, and we combined the descriptions to cover the terminal points that were furthest away. And in so doing, we retained ID 441, eliminated 412. And for the third pair of duplicates, we retained 424, eliminated 425, slightly minor modifications to the description to account for the 2 different projects. None of these required any reevaluation. They were all minor. On the next slide, again regarding the project list, there were some projects that were transferred, I mentioned, from the build network to the no build network. These are listed. And then as a consequence of that and removing the duplicates, there was a bit of renumbering that had to be done to kind of address the fact that we'd taken some projects out. But that's all been updated. It does mean that the project ID numbers that went to public comment in some cases are now different. And we have archived the public comment versions on our website. So if anyone wants to go back and see what project number 431 was compared to what it is now, if there's a difference, that the traceability is still there. If anyone has any confusion about that at all, we can certainly walk folks through. But we think that it's most important to focus on what's in the final version than incrementally. But it is archived on our website, quite easy to find. On the next slide, just a couple of minor changes that don't affect anything, but it does address some slightly inaccurate statements of who sponsored a project or where it's located. Again, it doesn't change any analysis, so this was really for completeness to correct some things which weren't precise as we went around this review process. So that covers everything that well, not everything, but that's the major things that we've done that's different. There in our constant strive for perfection. So you can you go back to slide 17, Haroon? In our constant strive for perfection, you know, as we look at this document, we still see things we think, wish we kind of done something slightly different there. So I wanted to, you know, for full transparency, bring to your attention as you kind of consider an endorsement this evening, that there are a number of very minor things that we might want to do to the document, which not to change it in any substantive way whatsoever. But yeah, you know, to kind of go back to what Council Member Friedrich was saying earlier, if we can explain it better, then we'd like to take the opportunity to do that before we take a final draft version to MBTA in December. So the sorts of things we'd be talking about doing after any possible endorsement from the committee this evening would be, there's a blank page, Roman numeral 2, which we might use to put a kind of a standard MBTA member list and group photo. It wasn't specifically reserved for that purpose. It was more to do with formatting it as a hard copy document, but that would be an appropriate use for that page if we do it. In terms of wording, you know, we'd like to kind of double, triple check consistent terminology and capitalization. You know, things like, do we have a capital P for plan or a lowercase p for plan? And are we consistent and appropriate? You know, when we refer to bus rapid transit in full, is that a capital B, capital R, capital T, or does it make sense to use lowercase since that's a generic mode like automobile? And so those sorts of things we'd like to address. Again, use of abbreviations is part of that. In some cases, grammar and spelling, you know, errors might be noted. Consistency checks between text and graphics, just to make sure they are, you know, like the title of a graphic is the same as the title in the text, kind of a thing, or, you know, it says not variations in that, which could lead to confusion. And equally anything that's optimally worded that we could simplify given the intended audience of the document. And then from an ongoing aesthetic appearance perspective, the project list, we'd like to add a front and back cover to the project list that makes it more consistent with the plan summary document as well. And to that end, Council Member Friedrichs did offer some suggested rewording of part of the first couple of pages of the project list, not the plan, the project list, that could potentially help a lay audience to kind of go through and understand it a little bit more clearly. So we would like to reserve ourselves the option of making those sorts of changes, but we're not going to start doing new analysis, changing the project list projects themselves or anything like that. So it's really just a strive for perfection that we'd like to reserve the option to do. With that, Haroon, if you want to jump ahead to next couple of slides, just to wrap up, and I'm going to hand back to you, Madam Chair. The transaction activities and schedule is graying out more and more bullets. We're down to the last two here, and the first one is, sorry, the first one that's not grayed out, November 22, obviously is this evening, and then December 8th, I think it is the date of the authority meeting at which we hope to request adoption subject to endorsement from the committees. And then on the final one then is the requested endorsement that we're seeking on slide 20 is to seek your approval of a recommendation to the authority to adopt the transaction plan and associated project list. And with that, Madam Chair, I hand back to you. I believe you're muted.
So sorry about that. Are there any further questions before before someone would like to make a motion? Okay, is there a motion to adopt?
Madam Chair, I move we adopt the transaction plan and associated project list. This is Signe.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Councilmember Milan.
Okay, so
Madam
someone
Chair,
seconded it.
just a point. Is the motion to adopt or to endorse the plan for adoption by
No,
the
right,
authority?
good point. Good point. It's approval of recommendation to the authority. You're right. We are making a recommendation. Signe, are you okay with that change?
Yeah, would you like me to restate it or is that good enough?
Restate.
Okay, I move the approval of a recommendation to the authority to adopt the transaction plan and associated project list.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay,
Sylvia.
thank you. All right. Let's see. Haroon, are you okay with a verbal vote on this, or would you like me to poll the members?
Madam Chair, a verbal vote is what we've been doing
Yeah.
in all our virtual meeting.
Okay, let me go back to our, okay. Okay, here we go. All right, board member Takis Karantonis.
I vote yes on behalf of Arlington, with some reservations that are not enough to, to change the vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Walter Alcorn,
Aye.
Supervisor Sylvia Glass,
Aye.
Councilmember Sarah Bagley.
Excuse me, aye.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Pamela Sebesky
Yes.
and Councilmember Signe Fredericks
Yes.
and Councilmember Stanley Milan.
Yes.
Okay, and I also vote aye. Did I leave anyone out?
Can I vote yes for the city of Fairfax as well?
I am sorry.
No problem.
Sorry,
Madam Chair.
Councilmember Seeley. Okay, excellent. So it was a unanimous vote. Thank you, everybody. Okay. We are back to our agenda. All right. Well, that was unanimous. And now, Ms. Monica Bachman, do you have any MBTA updates for us this evening?
Madam Chair, the only thing I'd like to say this evening, number one, is thank you, all of you, for hanging in there with us as we approach the tail end of this cycle of transaction. I know we update it every 5 years, but it's really a 2.5-year process when you look at the work and the meeting it involves. And thank you for your questions. Thank you for your input. We are truly appreciative. On the authority level, that's not transaction related, we are in the process of developing our legislative program for 2023. Our priorities are really the same from 2022. We did delete one regarding the ability to have virtual meetings because as we are here tonight meeting virtually, we have that provision. Number one, as we continue to state, is protect the revenue stream. Number two, we do, and not only for the authority, but all the revenue streams that we have in Northern Virginia. We want to make sure that those revenues are protected. We want to get the $38.5 million back. That would be the last remaining amount of monies from the 2018 diversion of revenues to Metro. But we really want to protect the revenue streams and making sure that there is no future diversions. And Madam
Excellent.
Chair, that's all I have.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much. Do any members have any further comments? Okay, yes, Councilmember Signe Fredericks.
I just wanted to say I know that we're at the end of a little bit of a project that's been enormous and lasted a long time. And I must say, Monica, you and your staff have been a delight to work with. This is really hard stuff for someone who's a layperson, and you guys have done a great job of accommodating occasional lack of understanding and doing it so kindly and so professionally. So I really appreciate you all.
Well, thank you, council member. And I wish I could take the credit, but I really have to give credit to Keith and Shri and Haroon and the planning team and the consultant team. Some of this stuff, when they talk to me about it, I'm like, we need to bring it down a bit when you're explaining to me, but thank you. They've done an incredible job. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you have. Thank you so much for those comments. And I wholeheartedly agree. And I've enjoyed serving as chair, and I've enjoyed serving with all of you. So that ends the meeting. I hope everyone has a good evening. There's nothing else to add.
Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, happy
Thanksgiving
Thanksgiving,
indeed.
everyone. Exactly. Stay
Yeah.
safe.